Tonight, we're exploring the life and legacy of Winston Churchill, a man who didn't just witness the 20th century, but helped shape it, stumble through it, and somehow outlast it. From the age of cavalry charges to the dawn of nuclear diplomacy, Churchill remained at the centre of events longer than most regimes survived. So before we all get settled in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and whether you think Churchill was a saviour, a relic, or something in between. Now, let's begin this remarkable story, and may it teach you something new, even as you drift to sleep. In the final decade of his life, Winston Churchill spent much of his time painting landscapes in the gardens of his Kent estate. Surrounded by quiet countryside, he gave the impression of a man finally at peace, but the brush in his hand belied a restless mind. Churchill had never learned to sit still. Even in retirement, he tracked international affairs with the same energy he had shown on the front lines of war and in the halls of Parliament. His body slowed, but his instinct to engage never dulled. Churchill's legacy tends to be filtered through a narrow lens, often reduced to war speeches, V-signs, and black and white photographs of a scowling man in a bowler hat. But the fuller picture is more intricate. His life was not a straight rise to greatness, but a series of ascents, collapses, and improbable comebacks. The fact that he remained a political force for over 60 years is less a testament to universal admiration and more to his extraordinary ability to survive reputational defeat. He was born in 1874 into aristocracy at Blenheim Palace, a birthplace that foreshadowed neither his charisma nor his contradictions. The Victorian Empire was near its zenith. The idea of its decline would have been unthinkable to the ruling classes, including Churchill's own family. Yet by the end of his life he would see that very empire fragment and still struggle to let it go. Churchill did not emerge fully formed as a statesman. His early years were marked by deep emotional neglect. He wrote countless letters to a mother who rarely answered, and he was largely raised by a beloved nanny. From this distance grew a need for attention that he later sought through action and conflict. He would eventually seek both on battlefields and in front of microphones. His worldview was shaped by war and imperialism. He served as a soldier and war correspondent in Cuba, India, Sudan, and South Africa. These experiences were not merely formative, they became the raw material for books, speeches, and the mythology of his public persona. His was a life in constant search of validation, not only from the public, but from history itself. Churchill's political career was defined by volatility. He switched parties more than once. He made decisions that were brilliant in foresight and others that were catastrophic. He was at times celebrated as indispensable and at others dismissed as dangerously outdated. What remained consistent was his belief in Britain's unique role in world affairs and his personal mission to preserve it. He held office during global upheaval, but was no stranger to periods of isolation. His wilderness years, particularly in the 1930s, were marked by fierce warnings about the rise of fascism, warnings that few wanted to hear. He was in many ways a man out of step with his era, and yet, when crisis struck, it was Churchill to whom the country turned. This first episode serves not to judge, but to introduce. In the chapters ahead, we will examine the evolution of Churchill as a soldier, a writer, a politician, and ultimately as a symbol one both revered and contested. We will not shy away from the darker parts of his record, nor will we simplify the moments of true courage. What emerges is not a clean narrative, but a vivid one. Churchill was not a man of moderation. He embraced risk, welcomed argument, and often preferred the arena of conflict to the consensus of diplomacy. Whether in victory or defeat, he rarely sought stillness. In the next episode, we will return to Blenheim Palace not as a symbol of grandeur, but as the cold, echoing world of a lonely child. Before Churchill shaped nations, he was a boy writing unanswered letters, already hungry for the attention that history would one day give him in abundance. Winston Churchill was born on the 30th of November 1874 in one of the grandest homes in England, Blenheim Palace. It was not just a birthplace, it was a monument to aristocracy, built for his ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough, after a victorious battle 3 centuries earlier. Winston entered the world with title, history, and marble ceilings, but not much warmth. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a rising Conservative politician, sharp-witted and socially ambitious. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was an American heiress known for her beauty, charm, and intense social life. Their son, however, was more an ornament of lineage than the focus of parental attention. From an early age, Winston was handed over to a nanny, Elizabeth Everest, a woman he later described with more affection than either parent. It was she who read to him, comforted him, and provided the only emotional stability he knew in childhood. This absence left a mark. Letters from young Winston to his mother survive today, dozens of them pleading for visits, asking for praise, and rarely receiving either. The emotional distance hardened into resolve. He learned to demand attention not through obedience, but by standing out. Education was no exception. Churchill struggled at Harrow School, particularly with mathematics and classical languages. He was not unintelligent, far from it, but he lacked discipline and had little interest in conforming to traditional academic expectations. He preferred history and English, especially if they involved heroic tales or rhetorical flourish. By his own account, he found the regimentation of school suffocating, yet even there his writing talent began to emerge. His early academic failures did not block his path. His family's name still opened doors. After repeated attempts, he gained entry to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, where he trained as a cavalry officer. This was not the route of a reluctant aristocrat-appeasing tradition. Churchill actively sought military service, not simply out of duty, but out of a craving for action and recognition. At Sandhurst he did well. Freed from the classical curriculum and immersed in applied strategy and physical training, he thrived. Commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, Churchill began the next phase of his life, as a soldier, war correspondent, and adventurer. Between the ages of 21 and 25, Churchill's life moved at a remarkable pace. He saw action in Cuba, British India, the Sudan, and South Africa, often placing himself at the centre of danger. In the northwest frontier of India, he rode with cavalry against tribal forces. In the Sudan, he participated in the Battle of Omdurman. In South Africa during the Boer War, he was captured while accompanying a military train, then escaped from a prisoner of war camp, becoming a national sensation in the process. He chronicled these experiences with vivid prose, publishing articles and books that gained a wide readership. It was this period that shaped not only his understanding of empire and war, but also his ability to control narrative. Churchill quickly understood that power came not only from action, but from how that action was described and remembered. It is important to note, however, that his early experiences also locked in a worldview that would later place him at odds with the 20th century. He saw the British Empire not as a historical accident or burden, but as a moral mission. He believed in its civilizing power and dismissed many of its critics as naive or dangerous. This conviction would inform and complicate his politics for decades to come. By the time Churchill returned to Britain, he was already known to the public not only as a soldier, but as a man of words. He had begun to see Parliament as the next frontier, and once he entered politics he would rarely leave it again. The boy who'd once begged for his mother's approval was now greeted by the London press as a national hero. The approval he longed for as a child was now arriving by other means: applause, headlines, and eventually votes. But celebrity did not guarantee stability. His next steps would test his instincts, alienate allies, and define his lifelong tendency to embrace risk, both political and personal. When Winston Churchill returned from the Boer War in South Africa at the age of 25, he did not quietly settle into civilian life. He arrived in Britain with published books, press fame, and a name already known to the public. His daring escape from a prisoner of war camp had made front pages. His reputation, shaped as much by narrative as by fact, preceded him. Churchill immediately launched his political career, standing for Parliament in Oldham in the year 1900. He lost. Then, as ever, he tried again, and in the following year he won. At 26, Churchill took his seat in the House of Commons. His early years in Parliament were marked by restlessness and ambition. He did not align himself permanently with one political faction. Though elected as a Conservative, he crossed the floor in 1904 and joined the Liberals. To Churchill, principle often mattered more than party, or perhaps more accurately, political relevance mattered more than loyalty. He sought movement, debate, and visibility. In Parliament, as on the battlefield, he preferred boldness to caution. As a young MP, Churchill focused on social reform. He supported measures for minimum wages, unemployment insurance, and labour protections. He believed, at least then, that government had a duty to reduce suffering and prevent unrest. This phase of his political life is sometimes overlooked, overshadowed by his later wartime leadership, but it reveals a complex view. Churchill, as a paternalistic reformer, committed to preserving order by improving conditions, though always within a deeply hierarchical worldview. His speeches were distinctive. They were formal, vivid, and unapologetically self-assured. He spoke not like a backbencher testing ideas, but like a man certain of his role in history. He admired structure and admired his own voice within it. While this rhetorical style gained him attention, it also provoked resentment. Older MPs often found his tone presumptuous, and younger ones found it exhausting. In 1910, Churchill was appointed Home Secretary, one of the highest offices in the British government. His time in the role was controversial. He authorised the deployment of troops during a Welsh miners' strike and defended the use of force in labour disputes. He also oversaw the introduction of prison reform, including more humane treatment for women and juveniles. The contradictions of his politics, progressive in some domains, authoritarian in others, began to take visible shape, but Churchill's appetite for greater responsibility did not subside. In 1911 he became First Lord of the Admiralty, placing him in charge of the Royal Navy at a time when tensions in Europe were rising rapidly. He modernised the fleet, championed technological innovation, and emphasised preparedness. He also characteristically sought visibility. His speeches warned of Germany's naval ambitions. His enthusiasm for strategic planning expanded into near obsession. When war broke out in 1914, Churchill was ready, and perhaps too ready. His central role in the planning of the Gallipoli campaign, an attempt to force a passage through the Dardanelles and capture Constantinople, would become one of the most controversial decisions of his life. The plan failed catastrophically. Allied troops, primarily from Britain, Australia and New Zealand, landed on the beaches of the Gallipoli Peninsula and encountered fierce Ottoman resistance. The terrain was misjudged, logistics faltered, and the casualties mounted. By the end of the campaign, over 100,000 men had died, and Churchill's political reputation was in ruins. He was removed from the Admiralty. Many thought his career was finished. The fall from grace was public and sharp. Accused of recklessness, blamed for strategic misjudgment, and increasingly isolated, Churchill faced the one thing he seemed to fear most: irrelevance. And yet, rather than retreat from public life, Churchill enlisted in the British Army. He returned to the Western Front in France, not as a general or minister, but as a lieutenant colonel commanding a battalion. For 5 months, he lived in the mud of the trenches, enduring shell fire and the daily risks of infantry warfare. It was a symbolic gesture, but also a genuine one. Churchill sought not just rehabilitation, but immersion, a reconnection to the realities he had previously shaped from afar. This period, both his fall from power and his return to active service, marked a critical turning point. It demonstrated the peculiar mixture of ego and conviction that defined him. He refused to disappear, even when silence might have served him better. He returned to Parliament in 1916, damaged but not undone. Churchill would go on to describe his life as a series of setbacks and recoveries. Gallipoli was the first major test of that cycle. It would not be the last. After returning from the trenches in 1916, Churchill once again re-entered political life, but this time with a diminished aura. Gallipoli had not been forgotten. Although his time on the Western Front had softened public hostility, many colleagues continued to regard him as impulsive, a talented but dangerous figure whose judgment was questionable in matters of strategy and restraint. In the immediate years after the First World War, Churchill sought to restore his relevance. He held various ministerial roles: Minister of Munitions, Secretary of State for War, and Secretary of State for Air. In these capacities, he supported British military intervention against Bolshevik forces during the Russian Civil War, an early expression of his lifelong opposition to communism. He viewed Bolshevism not simply as a Russian political development, but as a civilizational threat to Western democracy and liberal order. This conviction remained central to his worldview throughout his life. Yet his views were often out of step with public opinion. The British people, weary from war, were in no mood for further entanglements. Churchill's support for foreign interventions, particularly in support of unpopular White Russian generals, drew criticism across the political spectrum. His role in the Irish War of Independence also placed him in a politically sensitive position. Churchill oversaw the transition from war to treaty negotiations, which led to the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 and the eventual creation of the Irish Free State. He favoured compromise, not out of ideological sympathy, but from a realist's perspective. Prolonged conflict was unsustainable. Still, the outcome satisfied few. Unionists accused him of betrayal, Republicans of imperial interference. Once again, he found himself isolated, praised for eloquence, but rarely for diplomacy. By the mid-1920s, Churchill returned to the Conservative Party, the same party he had dramatically left 2 decades earlier. He was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1924 under Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. It was a prestigious position second only to the Prime Minister in influence, but one that brought new controversy. In 1925, Churchill made the fateful decision to return Britain to the gold standard, linking the pound sterling to gold at its pre-war value. The move was intended to restore financial prestige and economic discipline, but in practice it led to deflation, rising unemployment, and industrial unrest. Historians continue to debate the economic logic of the policy, but even contemporaries viewed the decision as a costly miscalculation. Churchill's grasp of economic nuance was limited, and the effects were severe, particularly in the coal and steel industries. His tenure as Chancellor coincided with increasing labour militancy. In May 1926, a general strike involving over 1.5 million workers brought the country to a standstill. Churchill edited the government's emergency newspaper during the crisis and reportedly advocated for a more forceful crackdown on strikers than even Prime Minister Baldwin considered appropriate. The episode further damaged his standing among working-class voters and reinforced perceptions of him as combative, privileged, and fundamentally unsympathetic to the needs of ordinary citizens. As the 1930s began, Churchill drifted to the political margins. He lost office with a Conservative defeat in 1929 and spent most of the following decade without a ministerial role. These years, known in Churchill's own terminology as his wilderness years, were marked by exclusion but not inactivity. He wrote prolifically histories, biographies, memoirs. He travelled, lectured, and continued to speak in the Commons. But his views, especially his continued defence of the British Empire and opposition to Indian self-rule, increasingly distanced him from the mainstream. While younger politicians such as Baldwin and Chamberlain sought a more pragmatic approach to decolonisation, Churchill clung to an imperial vision that many considered outdated. The shift in global politics, however, brought a new issue to the forefront: the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany. Here, Churchill's voice regained urgency. From the early 1930s, he warned of German rearmament and the dangers of appeasement. His speeches were sharp, well-researched, and unrelenting in tone. He criticised the government's foreign policy as naive and perilously slow to react. Yet few listened. War weariness and economic depression had made many Britons averse to confrontation. Chamberlain's policy of appeasement, culminating in the Munich Agreement of 1938, was popular at the time. Churchill, by contrast, appeared alarmist. His critics accused him of trying to resurrect his career through fear-mongering, and still he persisted. With no official post, little influence, and mounting scepticism from his peers, Churchill continued to speak, not because he was invited to, but because he believed history demanded it. His solitude in these years is perhaps the clearest example of his political character. He had once commanded fleets, directed battles, and shaped borders. Now he wrote warnings from the backbenches, warnings that few wanted to hear. But history, as it often does, would turn. And when it did, the man Britain had tried to ignore would once again be called to the front. On the 10th of May, 1940, Winston Churchill was summoned to Buckingham Palace. That morning, Germany had launched its invasion of France and the Low Countries. By the afternoon, Churchill was appointed Prime Minister. It was a role he had long sought, but he inherited it at the worst possible moment. The military situation was catastrophic. British forces on the continent were outmanoeuvred by the German blitzkrieg. The French line was collapsing. Belgium was under siege. Within weeks, British troops would be cornered at Dunkirk, with the real possibility that the entire British expeditionary force could be lost. The prospect of German occupation was no longer theoretical. Churchill entered office with little consensus and no honeymoon period. His predecessor, Neville Chamberlain, remained party leader and retained influence. Many Conservatives still distrusted Churchill, recalling his years of political inconsistency and past failures. The Labour Party, newly brought into a coalition government, viewed him with suspicion. Even King George VI had preferred a different candidate, but no better option presented itself. As one cabinet member put it, Churchill was chosen not because he was the most trusted, but because he was the only figure capable of galvanising national resistance. Churchill's response was immediate and unmistakable. He refused to consider surrender. In a series of carefully crafted speeches to Parliament and the public, he framed the struggle not merely as a war between states, but as a civilizational battle. His rhetoric fused history, duty, and endurance. He did not promise comfort, only defiance. The first of these addresses came on May 13th. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." The phrase became iconic not because it soothed, but because it acknowledged reality. Churchill understood that public morale was not sustained by illusions but by clarity of purpose. In the weeks that followed, he faced one of the most difficult military operations of the war, the evacuation of Dunkirk. Over 300,000 British and Allied soldiers were rescued across the English Channel, thanks to a combination of naval coordination, civilian effort, and German hesitation. Though a retreat, Churchill reframed it as a symbol of resilience. "Wars are not won by evacuations," he told the House of Commons, "but the survival of those men would prove vital in the months ahead." Throughout the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone. France surrendered in June. The United States remained neutral. The Soviet Union was, for the moment, aligned with Germany. In this isolation, Churchill's role became existential. He was not merely a political leader. He became the embodiment of British resistance. The Battle of Britain soon followed. German bombers attacked airfields, cities, and civilian targets. The Luftwaffe aimed to destroy British morale and clear the way for invasion. Instead, the Royal Air Force, though outnumbered, held its ground. Churchill praised the pilots with another speech that entered the historical canon. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. In private, the situation was graver. The bombings, especially during the Blitz, killed tens of thousands, displaced millions, and shattered infrastructure. Night after night, London burned. Churchill spent much of this time in underground war rooms beneath Whitehall, tracking developments, issuing orders, and absorbing reports. He slept little, drank heavily, dictated speeches to secretaries at all hours. The strain was visible, but he refused to slow down. One of the most remarkable aspects of Churchill's wartime leadership was his willingness to expose the public to danger he shared. He often visited bomb sites, walked the rubble-strewn streets, and spoke directly with those affected. It was a deliberate choice, symbolic, certainly, but also personal. He understood the emotional weight of presence. Internationally, Churchill's challenge was diplomatic as much as military. He worked relentlessly to bring the United States into the conflict, developing a close relationship with President Franklin Roosevelt. The Lend-Lease Act, passed in early 1941, provided Britain with crucial supplies. But full American entry into the war would only come after Pearl Harbor, over a year into Churchill's premiership. By that point, the war had become global. Churchill's role expanded accordingly. He coordinated with Allied leaders, oversaw strategy in North Africa, and dealt with complex relations with Stalin once the Soviet Union entered the conflict. He navigated these challenges with a blend of pragmatism and oratory, adapting as needed while maintaining his overarching message: victory at all costs. Yet Churchill's premiership during the war was not without criticism. Some questioned his strategic decisions, others found his leadership style autocratic. But for the majority of Britons, he remained a symbol of continuity in chaos, the voice on the radio who refused to capitulate. In the end, that defiance would help turn the tide. But Churchill understood, even in the glow of momentary triumph, that victory would bring its own reckoning. In May of 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Victory, long imagined and paid for in lives and rubble, had finally arrived. In Britain, the crowds gathered in Trafalgar Square and outside Buckingham Palace. There were fireworks, flags, and spontaneous singing. Winston Churchill, the wartime Prime Minister, appeared on a balcony with the royal family, cheered not just as a politician, but as a national saviour. Yet, only 2 months later, he would be gone from office. The general election of July 1945 came at a time of high emotion and deep exhaustion. Britain had endured 6 years of war, families had been separated, cities had been bombed. Millions had lived under rationing and uncertainty. The population now looked toward peace and toward rebuilding a country that, for all its pride, stood financially depleted and structurally battered. Churchill led the Conservatives into the campaign with the weight of wartime leadership behind him. But the Labour Party under Clement Attlee offered a different kind of vision, one focused not on global conflict but on domestic transformation. Their platform included the creation of a national health service, the expansion of public housing, and the nationalisation of key industries. It promised social security from the cradle to the grave. Churchill's campaign misfired. In a now infamous radio broadcast, he warned that a Labour government would need to rely on some form of Gestapo to implement its policies, a comparison that felt not only offensive but out of touch. The message was one of fear, at a time when the country longed for hope. Many voters respected Churchill as a wartime leader, but viewed him as unsuitable for post-war reconstruction. On the 26th of July, Labour won by a landslide. Churchill was stunned. His wife Clementine tried to comfort him, suggesting it might be a blessing in disguise. "It may be a blessing," he replied, "but it certainly seems very effectively disguised." He was no longer Prime Minister, but he was not silenced. In the immediate aftermath, Churchill withdrew to Chartwell, his country home, to rest and write. He remained the leader of the opposition, still a member of Parliament, and still a presence in public life. He began composing his wartime memoirs, a monumental multi-volume history, with the same urgency he had once applied to military dispatches. He did not intend to fade quietly into the background. By early 1946, he was already warning of a new global danger. In March, he travelled to Fulton, Missouri, at the invitation of US President Harry Truman. There, in a small American college, Churchill delivered one of the most consequential speeches of his career. It would later be known as the Iron Curtain speech. In it, he stated, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." This phrase, Iron Curtain, entered the geopolitical lexicon immediately. Churchill was describing the division of Europe between Western democracies and Eastern communist regimes, led by the Soviet Union. He called for a strengthening of Anglo-American cooperation and for vigilance against Soviet expansion. At the time, the speech was controversial. Some critics accused Churchill of reigniting wartime tensions. The Soviet press condemned him as a warmonger. Even many in Britain viewed the address as premature and unnecessarily provocative. After all, the Red Army had helped defeat Nazi Germany. Few wanted to envision another confrontation, especially not so soon after victory. But Churchill's instincts once again proved prescient. In the years that followed, the Cold War would intensify. The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Blockade, all unfolded within the conceptual framework Churchill had articulated in Missouri. Though no longer in office, Churchill remained a statesman of international weight. He met with world leaders, corresponded with Roosevelt's successors, and continued to speak on matters of global importance. He also received accolades for his writings. In 1953, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, not for a single book, but for the totality of his historical and biographical works. The committee praised his mastery of historical narrative and oratory. In that same year, something remarkable happened. Churchill returned to Downing Street. At the age of 78, he became Prime Minister, once again the oldest person to hold the office in modern British history. His second term, however, was markedly different from the first. The great military speeches were replaced by quieter diplomacy. The energy of wartime command was tempered by age and frequent health concerns. His stroke in 1953, kept secret from the public, limited his capacity, though he remained determined to appear strong. He was now leading a nation no longer at the centre of world power. The British Empire was dissolving. The United States and the Soviet Union dominated global affairs. Churchill sought to manage this transition, but his worldview remained rooted in an earlier time. By 1955, it became clear that he could not continue. He resigned, handing power to Anthony Eden, and retreated once more from public office. But retirement for Churchill was a relative concept. He continued to write, to speak, and to reflect. He had won the war, he had lost the peace, and still he could not walk away from the world stage. By the time Winston Churchill returned as Prime Minister in 1951, Britain had already begun to change in ways he found difficult to accept. The empire that had once stretched across continents was contracting rapidly. India, the jewel in the crown, had gained independence in 1947. Other colonies were following suit. The language of imperial stewardship was giving way to one of decolonization and self-determination. Churchill, now in his late 70s, found himself in a position that was both powerful and deeply symbolic. He had been summoned once again to lead the nation, this time not through war, but through transition. Yet the world he sought to preserve was vanishing, and the tools he had once wielded with such force no longer carried the same weight. His second premiership lacked the dramatic urgency of the first. There were no air raids, no grand coalitions, no defiant speeches against tyranny. Instead, there was economic strain, a diminished global role, and the complex task of managing Britain's position in a post-war, post-imperial landscape. Despite his age and declining health, Churchill remained active. He chaired cabinet meetings, met with foreign dignitaries, and travelled abroad when necessary. But he was no longer the tireless dynamo of the 1940s. His speeches were shorter, his energy uneven, and his memory occasionally unreliable. A serious stroke in 1953, kept hidden from the public at the time, significantly impaired his physical and cognitive strength. Yet even then he refused to step down. Symbolism became a central part of his role. In 1953, he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II, receiving the Order of the Garter. The young monarch had just ascended the throne, marking the beginning of a new era, one of youth, modernisation and shifting identities. Churchill's presence at her side during early state occasions was a deliberate gesture, a bridge between imperial grandeur and constitutional continuity. But it was clear that Churchill was governing in the past tense. His speeches continued to reference the greatness of the British Empire, the moral mission of colonial administration, and the importance of Anglo-American unity. He remained deeply sceptical of European integration, fearing that Britain would lose its global perspective by tying itself too closely to the continent. His vision was increasingly at odds with the emerging consensus. Domestically, his government struggled with inflation, labour unrest and housing shortages. While some reforms were introduced, Churchill showed little appetite for sweeping change. His interest lay elsewhere in foreign affairs, in the preservation of Britain's global stature, and in the historical narrative of the English-speaking peoples. He saw his place less in current administration than in the preservation of memory. In private, he began to devote more time to writing. His multi-volume series, The Second World War, had already secured his status as a literary statesman. He continued with A History of the English-Speaking Peoples, a project that blended historical overview with rhetorical idealism. His prose, often sweeping, occasionally selective, was designed not for academic rigour, but for cultural legacy. By 1955, the pressures of office and age could no longer be denied. After several delayed attempts, Churchill resigned as Prime Minister. He recommended his longtime political ally Anthony Eden as his successor, though even in departure he did not retreat quietly. He remained in Parliament for nearly a decade more, rarely attending but never entirely absent from national conversation. As the 1950s progressed, Britain continued to move in directions Churchill had long resisted. The Suez Crisis in 1956, occurring just a year after his resignation, was a profound moment of imperial reckoning. Britain, attempting to assert military control in Egypt without US support, was forced to withdraw under international pressure. It marked the end of Britain's pretensions to superpower status. Churchill, watching from the sidelines, reportedly said little, but the symbolism was unavoidable. He lived to see things he had once considered impossible: a European common market, the retreat from Africa and the Caribbean, nuclear parity between East and West, a culture more shaped by American television than British tradition. And yet, he endured as a statue in motion, a man who'd come to embody a certain image of Britain that no longer existed. His presence was both comforting and anachronistic, admired across parties, but increasingly irrelevant to policy. He was respected, even revered, but no longer central. Still, he refused to disappear. At 90, he was still receiving guests, giving interviews, and rereading the histories he had helped shape. His final years were not silent, but they were slower and tinged with a quiet recognition. The world he had fought to preserve had moved on without him. In his final years, Winston Churchill receded from public life, though never entirely from public consciousness. By the early 1960s, he was no longer active in Parliament and rarely appeared in public without assistance. His once booming voice, the voice that had carried a nation through its darkest hours, had grown faint, but his presence remained unmistakable. At Chartwell, the country home he had cherished for decades, Churchill spent long hours painting, landscapes mostly, quiet ponds, distant hills, muted skies. There was something meditative about it, a discipline that required patience, not persuasion. It was perhaps the only time in his life he had found comfort in stillness. He also read. He revisited the works of Gibbon, Macaulay, and the classical historians he had long admired. He reread his own writings, often aloud, as if rehearsing a legacy he knew would be debated for generations. Despite fading health, Churchill continued to receive visitors, foreign dignitaries, old colleagues, historians, and journalists. Some came out of admiration, others to pay respect to a living relic. He entertained them graciously, sometimes with sharp flashes of wit, sometimes in near silence. His memory had grown patchy, but certain names, Roosevelt, Stalin, de Gaulle, always seemed to trigger focus. There were occasional appearances in the House of Commons. He would arrive slowly, leaning on a cane, often with help. Members from all parties would rise. Not out of political loyalty, many of them had once been fierce critics, but out of recognition. Churchill had outlived most of his adversaries. He had, in some strange sense, become a national monument while still alive. On the 24th of January 1965, Winston Churchill died at the age of 90. The news was announced quietly, but within hours the bells of St. Paul's Cathedral tolled and crowds gathered outside his London home. The man who had been born under Queen Victoria was now mourned in the atomic age. His state funeral, the first for a non-royal since the death of the Duke of Wellington in the 19th century, was vast in scale and solemnity. Representatives from over 100 countries attended. President Charles de Gaulle stood beside Soviet leaders. Dwight Eisenhower, the wartime general and former US president, arrived to honour the man he had once planned a day with. Even former enemies came to watch as Britain said farewell to the man who had, at one time, stood alone on their behalf. The funeral barge moved slowly down the Thames, past silent cranes, their arms lowered in salute. It was a moment staged with grandeur, but carried a deeper stillness. It marked not just the end of a man's life, but the conclusion of an age he had defined, and in many ways refused to leave behind. And yet, Churchill's legacy did not conclude with his burial. If anything, it only began its second life, in argument, revision and interpretation. For some, Churchill remains the greatest Briton of the 20th century, the voice of defiance, the architect of victory, the embodiment of national will. His words, "We shall never surrender," are etched into schoolbooks, documentaries and public memory. For others, his record is more complicated. His views on empire, race and class now face sharper scrutiny. Critics point to his role in suppressing uprisings in colonial territories, his resistance to Indian independence, and his indifference during the Bengal famine of 1943. To these voices, Churchill represents not only courage, but also the darker instincts of empire. This tension is not easily resolved, nor should it be. History, after all, is not a eulogy, it is an inquiry. And Churchill, by his very nature, resists simplification. He was a man of deep flaws and unmatched will. He made decisions that saved millions and others that cost countless lives. He believed in the power of language, the strength of character, and the necessity of action, even when wrong. And yet, when Britain stood on the precipice, it was Churchill who found the words, the resolve, and the stamina to hold the line. That fact, historical, not mythical, remains central. His statue in Parliament Square now faces the Houses of Parliament, where he once thundered at both friends and foes. Tourists pass by daily. Some stop, some take photos, some keep walking. The debate continues as perhaps he would have wanted, because Churchill was not a man who sought closure, he sought relevance, and in that he succeeded. Churchill's life was a monument to resistance, resistance to tyranny, to irrelevance, to time itself. But sometimes history takes a very different turn, not through resistance but through defiance. Not by preserving the old world, but by burning its foundations and building something entirely new. And few figures in history try to rewrite their world as boldly as a man who ruled more than 3,000 years before Churchill ever spoke into a radio microphone. A man who didn't just challenge tradition, he challenged the gods themselves. His name was Akhenaten, and his story is one of the strangest, most visionary, and most controversial chapters in all of ancient history. So tonight we're heading back, way back to the sands of 18th dynasty Egypt, to a time of pyramids, temples, and a single man who dared to erase them all. Egypt wasn't short on gods. By the time Amenhotep IV came to the throne around 1350 BCE, the pantheon was crowded, jackal-headed Anubis, ibis-faced Thoth, motherly Isis, crocodilian Sobek, falcon-headed Horus, and of course the great sun god Ra. But one deity towered above the rest in earthly power. Amun, whose priests in Thebes had grown so rich, so organised, and so politically entangled that they operated like a second government. Some say they were the real government, and then came a boy pharaoh with a different idea. Amenhotep IV was born into splendour. His father, Amenhotep III, ruled Egypt at its peak, a time of opulent temples, international diplomacy, and near-total dominance in the region. His mother, Queen Tiye, was intelligent, politically skilled, and unusually powerful for her time. But their son was different. Even early on, something about Amenhotep IV didn't quite align with expectations. He was reclusive, devoted to religious thought. awkward in public ceremonies. While most princes were trained in hunting, combat, and ritualized masculinity, this young man seemed drawn to the spiritual rather than the martial. Instead of chariot races, he lingered in sun-drenched courtyards. Instead of rituals to Amun, he stared up at the sky. And that's where it started, not with politics, not even with rebellion, but with the sun. To most Egyptians, the sun god was Ra the mighty, all-seeing father of the sky. But Amenhotep IV focused not on Ra's divine body, but on his light, the Aten, the visible solar disk itself. This wasn't a new concept, but the way Amenhotep interpreted it was. For him, the Aten wasn't just part of creation, it was creation. The Aten gave life to all things equally, from kings to farmers to foreign lands. There were no intermediary gods, no Baroque mythologies, only the sun reaching out with its rays. At first, his devotion seemed eccentric but harmless. He built a few temples dedicated to the Aten, often alongside more traditional ones. No one paid much attention. Pharaohs had personal cults all the time. It was part of the job. But then his behavior shifted. He began expanding the Aten's temples rapidly, especially at Karnak, Amun's sacred ground. These new structures had no roofs, letting sunlight pour directly into the sanctuary. The artistic style was unusual too, open courtyards, flowing lines, sunlit inscriptions. And the inscriptions? They praised Aten alone, not Amun-Re and his son the living god, as traditional formulas went. Just Aten and the pharaoh himself. Whispers spread in the priesthood. Was this still a king in the mould of his ancestors? Or was he preparing to replace Egypt's religion? Then came the first irreversible decision. In the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. It was more than a name, it was a declaration. From this point forward, he wasn't merely worshipping a god, he was embodying its will. That same year, he ordered the construction of a new capital far from Thebes, away from the priests and the memories of the old order. He chose an untouched stretch of desert near the Nile, midway between Memphis and Thebes, a blank slate. He called it Akhetaten, Horizon of the Aten. It would be built in haste, filled with new art, new rules, new ceremonies. No temples to Amun, no references to the traditional gods, just sunlight, stone, and the king's divine connection to the disk in the sky. And here the revolution accelerated. Reliefs and inscriptions across Egypt were chiselled out, the name of Amun erased, sometimes violently, statues defaced, old hymns rewritten, priests deposed. The entire religious framework that had sustained Egypt for nearly 2 millennia was being dismantled, not by foreign invaders, not by famine, but by the pharaoh himself. To many, it was heresy. To Akhenaten, it was purification. But why? Was it spiritual conviction, a political move to weaken the priesthood, a personal obsession, or perhaps all three? Historians remain divided. Akhenaten left behind no explanation, only poetry praising the Aten, and art that depicted himself at the centre of it all. And while the religious establishment bristled, Akhenaten pressed on. In Akhetaten, the boundaries between human and divine blurred. He was not just a servant of Aten, he was Aten's chosen voice, often depicted receiving the sun's rays directly onto his crown. The people no longer worshipped many gods through priests. They worshipped the Aten through the pharaoh alone. It was monarchy, theology, and statecraft fused into a single, radiant image. But revolutions rarely unfold without consequence, and this one had just begun. By the 6th year of his reign, Akhenaten's transformation from eccentric monarch to religious revolutionary was complete. Egypt, a civilization built on tradition, was being re-scripted by a man who believed that divine truth came not from temples or priests, but directly from the sun. In Akhetaten, the new capital city rising from the desert, everything reflected his vision. The buildings were oriented toward the east, catching the morning light. The architecture was open, bathed in sunlight, rejecting the shadowy sanctuaries of Amun's temples. There were no colossal statues of gods with animal heads, no hidden altars, no complex rites performed behind closed doors. The Aten was light, and light needed no mystery. But behind the poetic metaphors and limestone courtyards, something far more radical was taking shape. Akhenaten began issuing edicts that targeted the very foundations of Egyptian religion. The names of gods Amun, Mut, Khonsu and others were not just ignored, they were erased, chiselled out from inscriptions, sanded from statues, scrubbed from tombs. This wasn't a gentle evolution, it was a purge. The priests of Amun, once the most powerful non-royal institution in Egypt, found themselves abruptly dismissed, their temples closed, their statues dismantled, their property seized. The economic heart of Thebes, a city that had thrived under centuries of devotion to Amun, was gutted. Its sacred lake stood still. Its rituals went silent. This level of theological restructuring was unprecedented. Egyptian religion had always been pluralistic. Gods coexisted, overlapped, merged. Pharaohs could favour one deity over another, but they rarely invalidated the rest. Religion in Egypt was both local and Laird the crocodile god might rule one region, while the vulture goddess reigned in another. But Akhenaten rejected all of this. In his system, there was no pantheon. There was only the Aten, and beneath the Aten, only one human intermediary, Akhenaten himself. And this change was not confined to temples or hymns, it reshaped the entire way power was depicted. In reliefs and carvings, the traditional image of the pharaoh offering gifts to a god was replaced by scenes of Akhenaten and his family receiving the Aten's rays directly. The sun discs stretched down arms like fingers, touching only their faces and hands. No priests, no commoners, no sacred animals, just the royal family and light. The symbolism was unmistakable. The king was not a servant of the gods. He was the centre of their energy, a living conduit, a sunlit sovereign. The new artistic style mirrored this shift. Figures became more elongated, curved, even androgynous. Akhenaten was depicted with wide hips, a protruding belly, narrow limbs, and full lips. Gone was the idealized muscular king. In his place stood a strangely human or perhaps superhuman figure, transcending gender and form. Was this a theological statement, a personal one, or a deliberate break from the artistic rigidity of previous dynasties? No one knows for certain, but the change was comprehensive. It wasn't just Akhenaten. Nefertiti, his queen, appeared in similar form. Their daughters were shown in unprecedented detail, playing, embracing, mourning. Intimacy replaced symbolism, family scenes replaced battle victories. Even the gods were no longer depicted. The Aten had no face, no personality, only light. Back in Thebes and across Egypt, this revolution caused disorientation. For ordinary Egyptians, the gods weren't just abstract concepts, they were household names. They guarded granaries, protected the dead, and explained the Nile's rhythms. To remove them was to disrupt daily life, not just theology. And yet, for nearly a decade, Akhenaten's system held. He sent royal decrees across the country, he recarved sacred texts, he renamed cities, he commissioned statues of himself and the Aten in staggering numbers. Even his court officials were rebranded as servants of the Aten, and his name was added to their tombs, often more prominently than their own. Foreign diplomats visiting Egypt were confused. Some referred to Akhenaten as the Sun King, others as the only one who speaks for the land. Trade continued, but cautiously. Egypt still had wealth and grain, but now also a ruler who spoke to light instead of gods. And what of Nefertiti? She stood beside him, always, often wearing the same crown, performing the same rituals. Some scholars believe she was more than a queen, that she may have been a co-ruler in practice, or even in name. Together, they projected an image of divine unity, a royal couple illuminated directly by the sun. But revolutions have a cost. While Akhenaten gazed skyward, the ground beneath him was shifting. Dissent festered quietly. The priesthood waited. The common people adapted publicly and murmured privately. The monuments were radiant, the poetry exquisite, the city well planned, but something even then felt brittle. Akhenaten had changed the gods. The question now was whether he had changed Egypt or simply painted over it with sunlight. In the centre of Egypt, midway between the old capitals of Memphis and Thebes, rose a city that had no past. It was not built atop an older settlement, nor did it inherit sacred ground. It was chosen for one reason only: the sunrise. The cliffs in the distance formed a natural curve, and through that curve, on certain days, the sun appeared to rise with perfect symmetry. To Akhenaten, this wasn't a coincidence. It was a sign. And so, in a place where no city had ever stood, he ordered the construction of one Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. It was a declaration of purpose. Here there would be no temples to Amun, no priests whispering in incense-filled sanctuaries. Akhetaten would be a city of light, where every stone, every window, every courtyard was designed to receive the Aten's rays. It was an act of both architecture and ideology, a capital conceived not around people but around a principle. Construction began with astonishing speed. Quarries were activated, labourers summoned, artisans employed. Using limestone soft, workable, abundant, they raised palaces, temples, residences and roads in record time. The city unfurled in a wide arc along the east bank of the Nile, stretching over 7 miles. At its heart stood the great temple of the Aten, an open-air complex with no roof, no inner sanctum, and no image of the god, only the sky above. Unlike traditional temples, which drew worshippers inward toward a hidden statue, this one exposed everything to the sun. There was no mystery, only visibility. Nearby stood the royal palace, linked by a ceremonial road to the temple. There, Akhenaten and Nefertiti appeared daily to the public, not in shadowy mystery, but under full sunlight. They blessed officials, offered incense, and performed rituals as living mediators of divine energy. Their presence was both political and religious, inseparable in this new world. The city was organized, clean, and well planned. Streets were straight. Walls were decorated with reliefs of the royal family. Private villas had gardens, storage rooms, and shrines to the Aten. Tombs were carved into the eastern cliffs, positioned so the first light of morning would strike their entrances. And at first glance, it seemed like a miracle of design. But beneath the gleaming white facades, problems were forming. For one, the city's location, so spiritually symbolic, was logistically fragile. Akhetaten had no natural defences, no significant trade routes, and limited agricultural capacity. Everything had to be imported: food, timber, stone, even water for its growing population. It was in many ways unsustainable. Second, the city's economy was unstable. By stripping the priesthood of Amun of their authority and wealth, Akhenaten had centralized power entirely in his person, but at a cost. The temples of Amun had not only been religious centers, they were also administrative, financial, and charitable institutions. Their disappearance left a vacuum that Akhenaten's state apparatus struggled to fill. Most dangerously, the new religion was never fully internalized by the people. For those who worked the fields, prayed for the afterlife, or left offerings at the feet of household gods, the Aten was remote. He had no face, no myths, no presence in dreams. He gave no comfort in sickness, offered no protection in childbirth. He was light, but not love. And Akhenaten didn't notice, or didn't care. He was consumed by his vision. In artwork from this period, he appears ever more otherworldly, elongated, luminous, almost ethereal. He holds hands with Nefertiti under the Aten's rays. He cradles daughters in intimate scenes of affection. He offers bread and incense to the sky. His focus seems less on empire, more on eternity. Foreign affairs, once managed with precision by previous pharaohs, began to erode. Egypt's vassal states in Canaan and Syria sent frantic letters begging for aid, weapons, reinforcements. Their pleas are preserved on the Amarna letters, Clay tablets discovered centuries later, most went unanswered. Inside Egypt, elite families continued to build tombs, but now inscribed with Akhenaten's praises. In one inscription, a royal official thanks the pharaoh for letting the Aten shine through him. In another, an administrator declares he lives only by the breath of the king. It was flattery. It was also fear. Because even as Akhenaten preached sunlight, his rule was absolute. Dissent was not tolerated. Old beliefs were not debated, they were erased. And though the city glittered in the noonday sun, shadows were forming at the edges. The people of Akhenaten bowed, worked, worshipped, but many did so with a second heart, still tethered to the gods that had protected their ancestors for centuries. The buildings stood bright, but foundations, if symbolic, can still crack. He didn't look like a pharaoh. That, perhaps more than his theology, is what first struck modern archaeologists as strange. Pharaohs, at least in traditional Egyptian art, had always been idealized, tall, broad-shouldered, eternally youthful, striding forward with spear or staff. Their bodies were symbols, not likenesses. They represented strength, eternity, and divine order. But Akhenaten, in nearly every depiction from his reign, he appears with a long, narrow face, high cheekbones, slanted eyes, and thick lips. His skull is elongated. His arms and fingers are long, delicate. His chest is narrow, sometimes even feminine in shape. His hips are wide. His belly protrudes slightly. It's as if the artist were painting a different species. And they were, in a sense, a different kind of king, a different kind of truth. Some historians have suggested that this was literal, that Akhenaten may have had a medical condition. Over the years, theories have included Marfan syndrome, Froelich syndrome, Klinefelter's, or even a form of epilepsy. These conditions can cause long limbs, soft facial features, and hormonal imbalances. But none of them explain the full range of what we see, and more importantly, none explain why every member of the royal family was depicted in similar form. Because it wasn't just Akhenaten. His wife Nefertiti and their 6 daughters are shown with elongated heads, curved necks, and stylized movements. In some scenes, they lounge together on cushions, under the Aten's rays, caressing each other's faces, playing with children, feeding each other grapes. These weren't stiff ceremonial poses. They were domestic, human, oddly tender, and that's the key. Akhenaten's revolution wasn't limited to religion. It was aesthetic, philosophical, and deeply symbolic. He wasn't just changing what Egyptians worshipped, he was changing how they saw. In the traditional style, art was formula. A priest always stood sideways, a king always faced forward, a god always held a staff or ankh. Perspective didn't matter, proportion didn't matter, symbol did. But in Amarna, the name now given to Akhenaten's art style form became expressive. People were shown in motion, with emotion, in pain, in play. Bodies bent, eyes turned, limbs curled. The sun touched everything. Some scholars believe this shift was part of a larger metaphysical statement, that all things flowed from the Aten, and therefore the boundaries between male and female, god and man, king and child, all blurred in its light. Others suggest that Akhenaten was simply rethinking the concept of divine kingship. Rather than present himself as an untouchable titan, he portrayed himself as a vulnerable intermediary, a flawed physical vessel channeling perfection. And there's yet another possibility. It was propaganda, a deliberate attempt to create a visual rupture with the past. By breaking all conventions, Akhenaten ensured that no one could confuse his regime with those that came before. But if that was the goal, it worked too well. For many Egyptians, this new art was alien. The softness of form, the absence of gods, the focus on one family, it felt unanchored, indulgent, and perhaps even dangerous. They whispered of weakness, they wondered why the king looked like that, they noticed that statues of older gods had vanished from public places, and even as Akhenaten leaned deeper into this new identity, questions rose around succession. The royal family, once so visible, began to fracture. At least one daughter disappears from records entirely. In some reliefs, Nefertiti is shown in positions of increasing power, sometimes even wearing the blue war crown typically reserved for kings. In others, she is absent. Was she elevated to co-ruler? Did she fall from favour? Did she die? No one knows. The records grow silent. Even Akhenaten himself becomes more distant. Scenes of public appearance decrease. Private rituals dominate. His portrayal becomes more godlike, more removed. In some images, his figure stretches almost unnaturally tall, as though rising into the light itself. And still the city remained. Akhetaten's courtyards glowed. Its streets echoed with prayers to a faceless sun. The palace walls were painted with moments of intimacy, lightness, and strange beauty. And in the centre of it all, the pharaoh, half man, half idea, ruled from his throne beneath the sky. But the sky was beginning to darken. Famine began to spread across parts of Egypt. Letters from foreign governors went unanswered. Trade slowed. And beneath the surface, the old priesthood, quiet but watching, began to reawaken. Akhenaten had changed the gods. He had changed the art. He had even changed the face of the king. But he could not change the Nile, and he could not stop time. If Akhenaten was the sun in the new sky, then Nefertiti was his brightest reflection. She wasn't merely the pharaoh's wife, she was his co-ruler, his ceremonial partner, his theological mirror. In temple reliefs, she appears standing at equal height, sometimes wearing the same regalia, the tall blue crown, the Uraeus serpent, even the sun disk. In some scenes, she offers sacrifices on her own. In others, she strikes down enemies with a mace, an image typically reserved for kings. This wasn't symbolism, it was power. Nefertiti's name meant the beautiful one has come, and her image would go on to become one of the most iconic faces in history, immortalized by a painted bust discovered centuries later, now housed in Berlin. But behind that serene expression was a woman far more politically engaged than most queens before her. She had 6 known daughters with Akhenaten, their names Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankesenpaten, Neferneferuaten, Tasherit, Neferneferua and Setepenra appear throughout the tombs and stelae of Amarna. They are shown playing music, sitting on laps, mourning beneath sunbeams. These are the most human portrayals of children in all of Egyptian art. And then they start disappearing. One by one, their images are removed or stopped entirely. One daughter, Meketaten, is shown in a mourning scene that may depict her funeral. Others vanish without explanation. There are no records of marriages, deaths, or royal transitions. Just sudden absence. Nefertiti, too, begins to fade. In the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, she appears in public ceremonies. In the 13th, silence. Her name is dropped from inscriptions. Her titles go unused. Some historians believe she died. Others suggest she was elevated even further, possibly taking on a new identity as Neferneferuaten, a co-regent or even sole ruler under a different name. And then there's the boy. A child appears in the late records of the Amarna period, a royal son, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, named Tutenhaten. His parentage remains a mystery. He is never shown with his mother. He is never shown with Akhenaten, yet he bears the royal suffix Aten, linking him to the solar cult. Was he Akhenaten's son, the son of another royal wife, or even a symbolic heir adopted into the line? We may never know. The records of this period are not just incomplete, they are deliberately erased. But hints remain. One theory holds that Nefertiti assumed power after Akhenaten's death, ruling under a male name, possibly even wearing the false beard and full titulary of a pharaoh. Some scholars suggest she may have ruled as Smenkhkare, a shadowy figure who appears in inscriptions briefly, then vanishes. Others argue Smenkhkare was a different prince, possibly Akhenaten's brother or son. Still others point to Neferneferuaten, a name once thought to be a poetic form of Nefertiti's, now believed by many to have been a short-lived pharaoh in her own right. The evidence is fragmented. The names are similar, the timelines overlap. It is as if someone tried very hard to blur the ending of the Amarna reign, and perhaps they did. What's certain is this: By the 14th year of Akhenaten's rule, the royal family was in decline. The daughters were gone or hidden. Nefertiti, whether dead or transformed, was no longer publicly present. Foreign embassies had stopped writing. The city of Akhetaten, once flooded with tribute, was shrinking. And yet Akhenaten remained. Alone in his city of sunlight, he continued performing rituals to the Aten, now joined only by a few remaining officials. The once busy courtyards of the great temple stood silent. The royal road cracked in the heat. The murals faded. In his final years, Akhenaten withdrew further into himself. He no longer appeared as a father, or even as a man, but as a symbol. One inscription shows him standing beneath the Aten, faceless, surrounded by empty space. The message is clear. The king is not a ruler of men, but a vessel for light. But light does not feed cities. It does not protect borders. It does not write succession laws. And as Egypt began to slip into disorder, the Aten offered no answer. Somewhere in this twilight, in these final dry years, Tutankhaten survived. A boy raised in the remains of a revolution. His future would be shaped not by the light of Aten, but by the shadows that followed. The sun still rose. The rituals still played out. The courtyards of Akhetaten still gleamed in the morning light. But the city and the world Akhenaten had built was crumbling. Famine kam first. Whether from environmental changes, Nile flood failure, or broken supply lines, the region faced a food crisis. Akhetaten, never self-sufficient, had always relied on shipments from the north and south. When the granaries emptied, even the brightness of the Aten could not fill bellies. Labourers left. Artisans disappeared. Tombs were abandoned mid-carving. Then came unrest. Letters recovered from the Amarna archives' clay tablets written by foreign vassal rulers show growing desperation. One pleads for archers to defend against invaders. Another begs for gold to pay mercenaries. All suggest that Egypt's grip on its empire was slipping, and that no one was listening. The reason no one was listening? Akhenaten had stopped responding. In his final years, the pharaoh seemed increasingly detached, not just from foreign affairs, but from earthly life itself. He issued few decrees. He rarely appeared in person. When he did, he stood still and silent, as if absorbing the rays of the Aten more than acting on them. He still prayed, still offered incense, still built temples, small ones, modest and unfinished, scattered around Akhetaten like fading reflections of a once grand vision, but his people no longer watched. And many had already left. The bureaucrats who remained wrote careful inscriptions, full of forced devotion. The great ruler, the light of Aten, may he live forever. But behind closed doors, the murmurs returned. Some began whispering forbidden names. Others began sneaking offerings to old gods, small statues buried in garden plots, faint images of Amun sketched in hidden rooms. The old religion had not been destroyed. It had merely been silenced. And silence, in Egypt, never lasted. By the time Akhenaten died sometime around year 17 of his reign, his revolution was exhausted, his family was fractured, his city underpopulated, and his legacy uncertain. There was no triumphant funeral, no massive pyramid, no enduring inscription of legacy. In fact, no one knows where he was buried. His body was likely entombed in the cliffs near Akhetaten, but the tomb was later defaced, the contents likely removed. His name, once etched across every stone, would soon be targeted for erasure. But before that came one final experiment. In the chaotic months that followed Akhenaten's death, someone, perhaps Nefertiti as Neferneferuaten, perhaps a male heir named Smenkre, tried to continue the Atenist project. For a brief moment, it looked as if the city might hold. A new pharaoh ruled in the same capital. The same sun disk still glowed above official seals. The revolution gasped for breath. It didn't last. Within just a few years, the court had abandoned Akhetaten entirely. The royal family, now under the name of a boy king Tutankhaten, returned to Thebes. And almost immediately, his name changed. The suffix Aten was replaced by Amun. He became Tutankhamen. a symbolic rejoining of the old order. The temples to Amun reopened, the priests returned, the buried statues were dug up and polished. The Aten was not outlawed, it was simply forgotten. His temples were stripped, his inscriptions chiselled off walls. The name of Akhenaten became one of the earliest examples in recorded history of a political damnatio memoriae, a deliberate erasure from history. Even the city of Akhetaten was left to decay. Sand filled its streets. Winds wore down its columns. Villagers would later mine it for bricks. For centuries, no one remembered it had ever existed. And yet the questions remained. Why had Akhenaten insisted so completely on this vision? Why did he pursue it despite famine, failure, and resistance? Was it faith, madness, conviction, or something more complicated? Some scholars suggest that Akhenaten saw himself not just as a king, but as a messenger, a prophet who genuinely believed he had seen divine truth in the Aten's light. Others argue that his revolution was political, a way to break the back of a corrupt priesthood and centralize control. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps it began as one and became the other. What is clear is this: Akhenaten refused to compromise. Even as Egypt fractured, even as his own family disappeared, even as the world turned against him, he never returned to the old gods. He never apologized. He never stopped facing the sky. He was a ruler who saw the divine not in thunder or myth, but in sunlight, simple, radiant, eternal. But eternity does not guarantee memory. And Akhenaten, the first monotheist, the builder of Akhetaten, the heretic pharaoh who stood alone in the sand, would vanish into silence for more than 3,000 years. The Nile has a long memory. Its waters carry silt and secrets through the centuries, layering the past beneath every season's flood. But for nearly 3,000 years, Akhenaten's name did not rise with the current. It stayed buried deliberately, surgically, almost vengefully. Because Egypt didn't just forget Akhenaten, it erased him. The process began quietly. Tutankhamun, the boy king, who had once been named in honor of Aten, reversed nearly every part of the religious revolution. He reopened temples to Amun. He restored the privileges of the old priesthood. He moved the capital back to Memphis, then Thebes. He even issued proclamations, apologizing to the gods on behalf of his predecessor. He was too young to have devised these moves himself, of course. The true architects were his advisors, men like Ai and Horemheb, high officials who had once served under Akhenaten, but now saw an opportunity to reclaim tradition and, more importantly, power. But restoration wasn't enough. They needed revenge. Atenism was not treated as an unfortunate misstep. It was labelled a heresy. The name of Akhenaten was declared illegitimate, stripped of royal status. His images were smashed. His cartouches, the oval rings containing a king's name, were chiselled out from monuments across Egypt. Reliefs were defaced. Wall scenes were recarved. Even statues of his daughters and Nefertiti were attacked. And then came the ultimate insult. His city, Akhetaten, was abandoned. Once filled with chants and sunlight, it now stood silent, wind-blown, and empty. Columns toppled, roofs cracked. Sand crept in through every broken lintel. Villagers from nearby towns began dismantling it for building material. The great temple of the Aten became a quarry. The royal road turned to dust. No other capital city in Egyptian history was so thoroughly removed from the map. It wasn't just urban abandonment, it was psychological. For generations after, scribes and priests wrote histories that skipped over the entire Amarna period. Akhenaten was not included in king lists. His years on the throne were absorbed into the reign of his father or son. In official memory, he had never existed. This kind of damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory, was rare but powerful in ancient Egypt. It was the ultimate punishment, to be denied an afterlife through forgetting. In their belief system, to speak a name was to keep a soul alive. To erase it was a kind of death beyond death. But even in erasure, fragments survived. In Thebes, a few poorly covered inscriptions retained traces of the sun disk. In tombs once carved for Amarna officials, Akhenaten's silhouette still flickered through plaster. and in one remote temple in Nubia, his name had been too deep to remove. These remnants remained silent until the modern world stumbled across them. In the 19th century, European explorers and scholars began to reassemble Egypt's lost past. They catalogued ruins, translated hieroglyphs, and noticed something strange. A gap. A pharaoh whose name didn't fit the standard pattern. A god who wasn't on the usual list. A city that appeared on no maps, but whose bricks dotted the hillsides. And then they found Amarna. In the sands near the modern village of El Amarna, archaeologists uncovered the remains of Akhenaten. They found palaces with floor paintings still intact, sun temples with roofless altars, workshops filled with shattered statue heads, all of them with deliberately mutilated faces. But most importantly, they found letters. Hundreds of clay tablets, now known as the Amarna letters, written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the day. These were correspondences between Egypt and its neighbours, Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and vassal kings in Canaan. They referenced Akhenaten by name. They dated his reign. They showed the reach of his diplomacy, even as his internal reforms consumed his kingdom. Suddenly, the story began to reassemble. But it didn't resemble anything people had expected. This wasn't just another pharaoh with a pyramid and a crown. This was a man who had rejected the gods, who changed the art, who changed the language, who renamed himself and the heavens, who built a city from nothing, and who was then buried by history so deeply it took millennia to find him. To some, he was a fanatic. To others, a proto-monotheist. Sigmund Freud even theorized that Akhenaten was the true inspiration behind Moses, a controversial idea still debated today. Artists admired the rawness of his portraits. Historians argued about whether he was a visionary or a failed dictator. And so Akhenaten returned not to power, but to memory. The Sun King was back on paper, in textbooks, in museums, not because the priests allowed it, not because Egypt welcomed him, but because history, by its nature, leaks. No memory can be sealed forever. What Akhenaten built has vanished. But what he meant, the questions he posed, the challenge he offered to tradition, still lingers. He forced the world to ask, what happens when one man tries to reinvent reality? The irony is hard to ignore. For a man whose name was erased from every monument, Akhenaten may now be the most famous forgotten pharaoh in history. His city is gone, his temples are rubble, his burial place remains uncertain. But the questions he forced into the world about belief, authority, beauty, and memory have never left. In some ways his revolution failed. The old gods returned. The priesthood re-established its control. Egypt continued for centuries with barely a whisper of his ideas. Even his son Tutankhamun tried to disassociate himself from his father's legacy, changing his name, restoring traditional religion, dying young and quietly. And yet, Akhenaten's shadow stretches far beyond the Nile Valley. When modern archaeologists unearthed the remains of Akhenaten, they weren't just surprised by the city's layout or its rapid construction, they were stunned by the art, the vulnerability, the humanity, the lack of perfection. A king shown kissing his daughter, a queen touching his hand, a family beneath sunlight, not behind stone. It was unlike anything else in the ancient world, and that had power. Artists and historians in the 19th and 20th centuries saw something radical in Akhenaten's world. Not just a break from Egyptian tradition, but a glimpse of modernity, of personality over iconography, of thought over ritual, of doubt, of belief reimagined. Sigmund Freud famously was obsessed with the figure. In his final major work, Moses and Monotheism, he proposed that Akhenaten, not Moses, was the first monotheist. That Atenism, not Judaism, was the original break from polytheism. It was a provocative, deeply speculative theory, and almost certainly wrong in detail, but it revealed something profound. Akhenaten forced the modern mind to confront the roots of belief. Others saw in him a proto-scientist, a man who rejected myth for the physical sun, not the god behind it, but the thing itself. An observable, radiant body that gave life. In that sense, he was the only pharaoh to make his religion measurable. Light became sacred, not magic, just sunlight. In art history, the Amarna period is now seen as one of the most important stylistic ruptures in ancient visual culture. It allowed expression, emotion, movement, the idea that royal figures could be vulnerable, even intimate. These innovations would vanish for centuries, but when rediscovered, they stood out as startlingly modern. And then, of course, there's Tutankhamun. Akhenaten's son, or at least his likely descendant, would die young and obscure, buried in a modest tomb. But when that tomb was discovered in 1922, its treasures captivated the world, and among them were traces of the father. The sun disk still hovered in certain carvings. Aten's rays still lingered in gold. His story was not told directly, but his fingerprints were everywhere. In this way, Akhenaten's legacy became a ghost inside a legend. We remember Tutankhamun as the golden boy, but the world he inherited was shaped by a father he could neither follow nor forget. Today, Akhenaten is studied in religious history courses, art history lectures, archaeology seminars. His face, elongated, strange, hypnotic, appears on museum walls, textbooks, documentaries. He is no longer hidden, but he is still mysterious. Who was he really? A religious visionary who glimpsed a deeper truth? A political manipulator trying to destroy a rival power base? A lonely man grieving family loss, retreating into mysticism? A monarch obsessed with light while ignoring the darkness at his feet? Probably all of these, and perhaps more, because Akhenaten, like all great disruptors, cannot be pinned down. His greatness and his failure are intertwined. His clarity was matched by his blindness. His legacy is both erased and inevitable. And that may be the most important part. Because not all revolutions succeed, not all visions are accepted, but some plant seeds deep enough that centuries, even millennia, cannot fully bury them. Akhenaten imagined a world reordered by a single source of life. He lived and ruled as if that vision were already real. And though it collapsed around him, and though his name was damned, the world never quite let him go. Light, after all, always leaves a trace. If this story made you wonder about history, about memory, about the fragility of power, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from the corners of time that almost got lost. Until next time, sleep well, and remember, even the erased can rise again, if someone dares to remember.